Hey, Trey here. So, if you've been following along, Us and Them and West Virginia Public Broadcasting have been collaborating with KCRW in Los Angeles on Red State, Blue State, a series of conversations that are leading up to the 2018 midterm elections. As of the time of this recording, all eyes are on the United States Senate and the vote deciding on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. Now, there was a time when the Supreme Court existed apart from the partisanship that's infected other government institutions. But President Trump's choice of Kavanaugh and the sexual assault accusations against the judge have sent Americans on the left and right running to their corners. And Trump, well, he's tapping into that.
The entire nation has witnessed the shameless conduct of the Democrat Party. They're willing to throw away every standard of decency, justice, fairness, and due process to get their way. They don't care how they get it. And I just hope you don't sit home, because bad things will happen if you sit home.
That's President Trump at a recent campaign rally in Wheeling, West Virginia. And our Red State host, Trey Kay, was there in the crowd. Hey, Trey.
Hi, Chery.
So, Trey, we're talking today about how the future of the Supreme Court has really, in many ways, become the front in the culture wars. Was it a big issue for the folks at this rally in Wheeling?
Well, yes and no. The event was packed, and there were a lot of amped-up Trump supporters from West Virginia and also enthusiastic people from neighboring Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the Kavanaugh confirmation was something that was really fresh in their minds.
I bet, yeah.
Most of the people that I spoke with had watched the hearing with Christine Blasey Ford and Judge Kavanaugh, and they described the whole thing as a circus. And as you might expect, they spoke with contempt about how the Democrats conducted themselves in this hearing. But afterwards, I spoke to a lot of the Trump supporters, and they kind of let me know that they've been thinking about the Supreme Court long before Brett Kavanaugh came along.
That is huge. And that's going to affect me and my children and my grandchildren. And that's very, very important that we get someone on the Supreme Court that follows the Constitution and doesn't deviate and do what's politically correct.
You know, one of the main reasons why I voted for Trump was that we knew that we were going to be able to put at least one person on there. I have 3 small children. I'd like to see a lot of our values and ideals that I consider to be American upheld. Everything, you know, I'm not necessarily trying to change the way things are, but I certainly don't want to see things go a completely different direction.
That was Barbara Kenneman and Ryan Pascoe, and Ryan Pascoe was incredibly passionate. And I got the sense that this is a moment that a lot of conservative voters in West Virginia have been waiting for.
Definitely. They've really got a lot riding on this, right?
Yeah, and another person who said this was Mark Renzella from McMacken, West Virginia.
I think for too long we've had judges come in who interpret the Constitution the way they feel at the moment, instead of reading what the Constitution says and what the founders intended. I believe the Constitution's a contract, not a living document. You know, if you believe it's a living document, then let me play a game of poker and we'll have living rules. My 2 pair beats your 4 of a kind, because I says it does this time. It doesn't make any sense. The Constitution becomes meaningless if you can change the meaning of it to suit your needs.
So, Trey, were there particular issues that people like Mark want to see the court interpret in a traditional way? Well,
Mark in particular spoke to me extensively about his concern of the Second Amendment and gun rights, and just about everybody I spoke to brought that up in one way or another. Abortion. Some people said that they hoped that long-settled law, like keeping prayer out of public schools, would be re-argued in front of a new, mostly conservative Supreme Court. Here's Joanna Brooks and her son, Kenny Brooks.
I don't like the fact that children are not exposed to prayer in the school, Bibles.
Our flag.
But the Supreme Court is the institution that made that decision. Pretty much.
They can change it if it's argued.
I'm hoping that with Trump, he will appoint justices that will change it.
Talking to Joanna and Kenny, I mean, that exchange just gave me insight of how people in West Virginia are really excited about the possibility of a 5-4 conservative majority. I mean, it's like something that they've been praying for, or it's like a prize that they've won. And they're none too happy about how liberals are trying to block them from it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've let you know about how some West Virginians are feeling about the Supreme Court. What I want to know from you is, do Californians talk about potential picks for the Supreme Court as a reason why they voted against Donald Trump?
They definitely do, Trey. I mean, we heard from progressive activists who are also taking a long view, looking at what the implications could be if the court ends up with a conservative majority for the first time in years. I want to play you some tape from a woman named Jenny Huntz.
The Supreme Court's going to make decisions affecting all of us for a generation. I have an 8-year-old son, and this is going to affect him. It's going to affect his kids. This is going to change the direction of the court for a generation.
Now, Jenny was taking part in a protest on a freeway overpass, and the activists, they were hanging a sign saying, "Stop Kavanaugh." And those car horns you were hearing, well, those were drivers honking as they were driving by. We also met there a woman named Jan Oxenberg. She's a writer, and she's concerned about equal rights issues.
I'm a lesbian. And I think anyone who isn't, a straight white male is in danger of having rights stripped away. That's their agenda. That is what they're seeking to turn around, is the Supreme Court as the vehicle for extending equal rights to one group after another in the United States. But America is about equal rights. America is about the rule of law, and it's in danger now. We have a president who is a thug, and we may now have a Supreme Court justice who acts like a thug.
Trey, listening to these folks, one of the things that really stands out to me is how much the Supreme Court has become a motivator for folks on both sides. I mean, even people who might not consider themselves to be traditionally politically active. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I found that there were people who may not really even kind of understand what the court does. But that didn't stop them from speaking passionately about the Supreme Court and why it was meaningful to them.
I talked about this evolution of the court going from being a kind of academic subject to a hot-button partisan topic with someone named Jessica Levinson. She teaches about the Supreme Court at Loyola Law School here in L.A.
I actually think it's very important that we do not see judges as politicians in robes, and I think that's increasingly what they're becoming. There is a difference between being a Republican and politically conservative and being a judge and legally conservative. If you're a Republican and you're conservative, what you really want is certain political outcomes. If you're a judge and you're conservative, it should be a different ideological take. You should be looking at, for instance, what did the framers intend at the time they wrote the Constitution? It should not be based on whether it helps Republicans or Democrats win an election. It should be based on their legal view.
But Jessica says she thinks, well, those lines are blurring.
But didn't those lines blur a long time ago? I think that many West Virginians would say that what's happening is just the pendulum swinging back into their direction.
Well, I'm sure it depends on your point of view, that some folks, conservatives might say, hey, the line started blurring all the way back with FDR when he was saying he was going to pack the court. And others might point to things that are more recent, like the Clarence Thomas hearings and the 2000 presidential election, right?
And don't forget Robert Bork.
Definitely. Jessica says one important thing to remember is that the impact of the Supreme Court's decisions, they go way beyond the term of any president or any senator. And she says blue state voters who are worried, well, they're right to be worried, at least about some of the issues that are on the line.
In California, I think that residents can be pretty certain that we will not outlaw or severely restrict women's rights to obtain an abortion. But there are other situations where, regardless of whether you live in a blue or a red state, it really cannot insulate you from Supreme Court decisions. Think of Citizens United, where the Supreme Court said, no, you are not permitted to try and limit the influence of money over politics in this way. No state can try and implement more control.
So basically, no matter how big your state is, conservative or liberal it may be, it can only buffer you so far. Now, Trey, we should say that obviously a lot of the folks we've heard from today lean pretty strongly either left or right, and that we're very well aware California and West Virginia both are home to plenty of independent, more middle-of-the-road voters, and we're going to be hearing from some of them during this series. But today we wanted to look at how the issue of the Supreme Court that may have once been nonpartisan, sort of more nuanced, has really become politicized due in large part to the Senate and the president.
A key player in this Supreme Court confirmation process is West Virginia's center-right Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. And next week, Chery, we're going to talk about the difference between red state and blue state Democrats in the U.S. Senate.
Looking forward to it, Trey. Thanks so much.
All right, talk to you next week, Chery.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
You've been listening to Red State, Blue State, a collaboration between us and them and KCRW in Santa Monica, California. This is one of many conversations that we'll present each week between now and the midterm elections. Would you like to be a part of this conversation? Why don't you let us hear from you? Look for Red State, Blue State online at wvpublic.org or at kcrw.com.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.